So if you're watching this video, you're probably thinking, should you live in Brooklyn versus Manhattan? Now, there are extreme differences between the two, and some people absolutely love living in Brooklyn and would never live in Manhattan, and then some people feel like the exact opposite, would never live in Brooklyn. So with Brooklyn particularly, you're of course going to have cheaper rent, that's for sure. There are very few neighborhoods in Brooklyn where the rents are actually higher than certain neighborhoods in Manhattan. So that's really the case with only a few of them. So some of those neighborhoods have amazing views of the Manhattan skyline, and that's why you're paying so much for that apartment, because the views are unbeatable. So some people love living in Brooklyn because they might work in Manhattan, or they like to dine in Manhattan or shop in Manhattan, but they like to also get out of the city. Now, when people in New York are referring to the city, even in New York City, when someone says the city, they're referring to Manhattan. So if somebody in Brooklyn is like, I'm gonna go into the city tonight, they are saying that they're gonna go from Brooklyn to Manhattan, because Manhattan is the main borough of the city, or the main island, because Manhattan is an island. So some people love being able to go into Manhattan and then also leave, but be very close to that part of the city. Now, there are other people who feel that if they don't live in Manhattan, they don't truly live in New York City, which is definitely not the case. There are other boroughs besides Manhattan, and Brooklyn isn't the only borough. There's also 3 other boroughs. So you do live in New York City if you live in Brooklyn, but I do see that they feel like they're not getting the true experience of New York City if they don't live in Manhattan, which for them may be the case. Maybe that is the true experience of living in New York City for them, living in Manhattan. But for others, they can get just as much of a New York City experience living in Brooklyn. So I definitely see both sides. And for me personally, I do live in Manhattan. So some could say that I'm biased because I don't live in Brooklyn. However, there are many times in Manhattan that sometimes I'm like, God, should I move to Brooklyn? I feel like every New Yorker goes through that who lives in Manhattan. They question if they should move to Brooklyn at some point. And some of those people stop questioning and just do it. That's happened to a lot of friends and a lot of clients throughout the years. So depending on which neighborhood you go to, you're going to get very, very different vibes. So North Brooklyn, you're closer to Manhattan, and it's going to still feel very city-like. However, if you go all the way down to South Brooklyn, you can almost feel like you're in a suburban town because it has that much of a suburban feel. There are literally some neighborhoods in South Brooklyn that have actual like homes, not townhomes, like homes, like freestanding homes. So very, very, very different from North Brooklyn, or very, very, very different from Manhattan. Also so beautiful, and like just spending a day in those neighborhoods sometimes is just like the most refreshing thing when you live in Manhattan and you're in the city every day. So you can get a lot more different lifestyles in Brooklyn. So, and if you want that suburban feel but still want to be living in New York City, you can easily do that in Brooklyn, especially South Brooklyn. Now, the transportation in Brooklyn can be a little bit tricky because when you get past mid-Brooklyn and you're going to South Brooklyn, the public transportation is not good. And this is something that has been addressed by the city of New York City many, many times, because it's very, very hard for people who live in South Brooklyn to commute into Manhattan if they don't have a car. So there's a lot of walking to either a train station or they have to go by the buses. So it's just not easy to get around. And then forget it if you want to get from Brooklyn to another borough. That's even more complicated. So there's actually a system that the city is implementing right now where they're going to have transportation that goes from Brooklyn to Queens, because that's been a problem for New York City's entire existence. So the transportation could be really, really bad in Brooklyn depending on where you are. So that's definitely something to consider. Now, if you do have a car or want to have a car at some point, you can easily do that in Brooklyn. So I live in Manhattan and I do have a car in Manhattan, but there was a time where I had a car and parked it in Brooklyn, even though I lived in Manhattan, because the Brooklyn parking spot was so much cheaper than I could find at Manhattan in that time. It was crazy. So I would literally take transportation from my apartment in Manhattan to Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and then take my car to the suburbs or anywhere I wanted to go that I needed the car for. So if you live in Brooklyn, you can easily find more affordable parking there, or even just street park in a lot of neighborhoods, because there's a lot more of that than there is in Manhattan. There's a lot of things to consider when choosing which borough you want to live in. And I do think that like every neighborhood or location as a whole, there are pros and cons. So if you are the type of person who wants to get that true New York City experience, you might want to consider trying to live in Manhattan to get that, because when I first came to New York City for work, I could not afford to live in Manhattan. And I actually did not live in New York City. I lived on the Jersey side. So I actually loved living there, but there were times where I wish I could have lived in Manhattan and gotten that true New York City experience when I was in my early 20s, but I couldn't afford to live in Manhattan at that time, especially off of what I was making. So I do live in Manhattan now, but part of me did wish at that time that I was able to live in Manhattan, because I felt like I wasn't getting that true New York City experience. And also, before I decided on the Jersey side, that's right outside of New York City, I was also looking at apartments in Williamsburg and Brooklyn. So I feel like even if I did end up choosing to live in Brooklyn instead of Jersey, then I probably would have had that same experience as well. I just technically would have been in New York City. So I do think that some people should try to live in Manhattan if they really, really, really feel that way. However, some people think they want to live in Manhattan Brooklyn, and then you show them places in Brooklyn that they've never seen before, and they're like, wait a second, this is awesome. Like, I had no idea that Brooklyn was like this, and then they fall in love with Brooklyn. So that happens too. So I really do think, like always, it's a personal decision that you have to know who you are as a person and your lifestyle to figure out what works best for you. So that's what I always say when I'm working with a client. So I would love to hear about your experiences in either Manhattan or Brooklyn, and let me know what your opinions are, because I honestly just love hearing from people about where they live in New York City and why they love it.